Brut, New Art on Stage.
Welcome everybody to the already 15th podcast of The Art of Assembly with the title Parliaments of Things and Beings. And my guests are philosopher Eva von Redecker and the theater collective ANTCOMPANY&Co, that in the conversation later on will be represented by its founding member Alexander Karschnia. The podcast is based on a live event in Brut, Vienna on April 4th, 2022. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm a performing arts curator, writer and dramaturg and the host of this series, which began already in January last year. So if you want to have a look, our website art-of-assembly.net has podcasts of all the episodes, videos of all lectures, and quite a bit of other material around the topic of assemblies in art, activism, and politics. As I often mention in the beginning, the series was not planned, but then in the end has happened in a quite paradoxical, but maybe also telling situation to talk about assemblies, because first, of course, the pandemic kind of made it impossible to gather and to assemble. So we were talking about assemblies on monitors or with some people joining, some not, and so on, you know, the whole thing. And of course, since a couple of weeks, assemblies, which are places of deliberation mainly, again are kind of not high in course, because with the war in Russian war on Ukraine, deliberation seems again to be not the thing to do, but to act or to fight and so on. So we are always speaking a little bit from a distance to our topic, which I think was actually quite good in a way for the last editions, because you can observe something maybe a little bit better from a distance. And I think today, in both contributions, there will be also speculation about the end of assembly or the possibilities of assemblies. So we have spoken about assemblies from quite many different angles in the last editions, and again, also about questions of representation, which are connected to the idea of assembly. So who is represented in our assemblies, who is not represented, who is represented by who is missing, and so on. But the who was most of the time a human who, not always, but mostly. So today we will pick up on a thread that we began with the 4th edition of Art of Assembly, when the Indian-British professor of law Radha D'Souza and the German theater maker Sibylle Peters were speculating on how to assemble with more than humans. In this session, Radha D'Souza argued that already the concept of rights, at least as we understand it in the West, but not only the West, is fundamentally flawed. It is always associated with private property, contracts, and contractual social relations. Drawing on insights from indigenous cultures and everyday practices, Radha pointed out the centrality of assembly for collective life amongst animals and humans. So if you haven't listened or watched this episode, I can recommend to listen to her talk. So the title of today's episode, Parliaments of Things and Beings, draws of course from the fundamental critique of modernity by philosopher Bruno Latour, who sketched out a parliament of things already in 1989, in which people, animals, plants, and objects jointly determine how they could decide on how they want to live together. 30 years later, so quite recently, Latour summed up, the question is no longer to grant rights to non-humans, but to accept to be dependent on them. So what does it actually mean? How can non-human representation look like? What would be a non-anthropocentric assembly, or rather a non-capitalist assembly, not to again fall in the trap of dividing humanity from nature, but rather to understand altogether as one interdependent network. Bruno Latour calls this Gaia, named after the Greek divine primal mother, which is a precursor of Mother Earth, of course. He draws, amongst others, on the Gaia hypothesis that already in the 1960s was developed by the microbiologist Lynn Margulis and the biophysicist James Lovelock, who described the biosphere as a dynamic system that interdependently stabilizes itself and its conditions. Another much more climate justice-oriented approach is the one by the environmental historian and historical geographer Jason W. Moore, who coined the term web of life. He propagates the term capitalocene instead of anthropocene in order to show that not humanity as such has created the disaster we are in, but a specific system of extractivism that not only exploits the earth but also most humans. Quote Jason Moore, nature is modernity's N-word for the web of life. Therefore, he calls for a working class environmentalism, which is a bit more Marxist in a way, like the more common term climate justice. So in today's edition, I'm very happy to have with us, virtually at least, the Berlin-based theater group andcompany&Co. that praises the intelligence of insects and considers renaming itself into ANTCOMPANY with a T, while philosopher Eva von Redecker proposes a revolution for life in order to escape the prison of capitalism and find new forms of solidarity. Care instead of domination, regeneration instead of utilization, participation instead of exploitation. So we start with a video contribution of ANTCOMPANY. It was actually already produced end of last year when we were supposed to happen the first time in a different constellation, and it didn't work out, but the video lecture was there already, so we can gain from that. ANTCOMPANY has been producing unmistakable political theater for almost 20 years on communism, capitalism, colonialism, and the politics of the day that are in the mix of their works all the time, with quite excessive puns and exuberant pop quotations. Since their formation in Frankfurt am Main in 2003 by Alexander Karschnia, Nicola Nord, and Sascha Sulima, they have created a vast network of artistic and political collaborators. All works are developed in co-authorship with all participants. Next to performance pieces in the context of the independent scene, for example, at Hau in Berlin, Forum Freies Theater, Musortum, etc., and lecture concerts, they produce theater plays with ensembles of state theaters like the Volksbühne am Rosa-Luxemburg-Platz and radio plays. Their works have been shown on festivals almost all around the world, from Brussels to Shanghai, and the group will be later represented by Alex Karschnia, one of the founding members and also a writer, I would say public intellectual, moderator of the series Die vierte Sache at Roter Salon of Volksbühne am Rosa-Luxemburg-Platz in Berlin, where he is currently also working as a dramaturg.
Hello, we are andcompany&Co. We are in the phase of transformation from andcompany with a D in andcompany with T, as in ant, meaning also ant, Ameise. The idea of our old name is itself a principle of assembly. We are always and everywhere looking for a new company, but so far we have only been looking for a human company with whom we can meet and network. But now we want to connect with the ants and become ants ourselves in a self-experiment. We noticed that one person can be pretty smart on their own, but the more people you meet, the harder it is to stay smart. And we noticed that in ourselves. 2 of us are definitely smarter than 3 of us, and so on. The intelligence level drops pretty quickly the more people there are. And according to the slogan, one person is intelligent, a mass of people is stupid, but nobody is as stupid as all of us together. And that is our huge problem right now. How are we supposed to cope with everything that is coming our way? And that's why we want to become ants, because with ants it's just the opposite. A single ant is alone rather stupid, but together they're incredibly smart. An ant's memory only lasts about 10 seconds, and yet they can do so much more together than we are able to do. The ants gather as an association of individual beings, but through their collective intelligence, they react to the other members of the group and to the environment in such a way that they can jointly cope with all the threats, the insecurity, and the complexity of their environment. Isn't that fantastic?
Ants don't assemble normally. They are social insects. They live in a society with a complex division of labor. They can cooperate. They are super cooperators, which means they must be able to communicate. Mostly they communicate by touch with their antennas or chemically with smell signals. They leave chemtrails on the ground. The best example is the ant street. Ants always find the shortest way to move around. That's how they solved what we humans call the messenger problem. It's a problem of logistics, how to find the most efficient way between different locations without visiting one location more than once. Ants just know how to do it because of their smell signals, Duftnoten. The shorter the way, the more ants can use it, and the stronger thus the smell becomes, because all of the ants leave their chemtrails. It's as simple as that. A system based on feedback loops. But sometimes feedback can be misleading. Then ants follow ants and run around in circles until they all drop dead.
But what does social mean? Social is not what has already been assembled. The social is not a matter or a substance, but the social has to be assembled or reassembled, just like you can assemble or reassemble a machine from different parts and pieces. And you can take these parts or pieces back together again. The social is not a building that you can enter or leave. The social is like an ongoing movement. If the dancer stops dancing, the dance is over.
Well, now with smart technology, the question is, aren't we humans as a species becoming more and more like ants ourselves? You know, with our smartphones in our pockets, or smart homes with smart heating systems, smart refrigerators. I mean, what makes them smart? They're smart because they send signals out all of the time. You know, just like us, when we surf on the internet, we also leave traces, even if we're not aware of, and just like signals, just like ants leave chemtrails on the ground or C-mails. But it's the interaction of that data that forms the complex, intelligent system, but it's not the interaction of us. And that's the main difference between real ants and these so-called ant algorithms. Because ant algorithms, they just lead to personalized advertisement in our feeds, or to this users who like that product also are interested in that product, so maybe you may be also interested in that product kind of thing. While the ants, they interact, they cooperate, that means they communicate, and they share information. So they are a self-organized superorganism.
I really like ants since I know that ants don't work as much as people think. In reality, they are actually rather lazy. Did you know that? Only 3 or 4% of the ants do all the work, and the rest is just running around. And the rest is doing nothing or nothing at all. So the question is, what do they do when they run around or they don't do anything? And there is one thing that they really, really love to do, and that is they love to share. And they even have a special organ, to do that, like a sharing organ. Alex, you're in my picture. They're, in a sharing organ, like a social belly or a social bag, in which they store like fine liquids, which they love to give, to almost anybody, even to their enemy in a fight. They give that liquid, and I was always asking myself, what is that? What is that exchange all about? Is that like an exchange, like a communication, or is that love, or what is it? It actually, I think it's just a gift. I think ants live in a gift economy.
Well, the thing is that humans as a species, we don't have such a specialized social organ. But it is this specific organ that characterizes ants as a species. What would be the organ that would characterize humans as a species? Well, it would be probably the brain. But is the brain a social organ? The brain is in fact a superorganism, a superorgan. We have an anthill in our head. The thoughts, ideas, millions of ants running around in our heads. So the brain might command all the body functions, but there's nothing that commands the brain. So what could we do about it? Well, the only thing that we really could do about it is to actually turn the brain into a social organ. And we are already doing this. Every time we share knowledge, thoughts, ideas, images, information, we use the brain as a social organ. And the thing is, when you share thoughts, ideas, knowledge, it's not becoming less. It's not exhaustible. Like a worker is exhausted by exploitation, or the ground is exhausted by extraction of natural resources or by industrial agriculture. Now, isn't that fantastic?
I'm your brain. I'm your brain.
Now the thing is that it's so much bigger than a mute object. It has this urge to expand, and at the same time it pulls everything towards itself. Everything gathers around the thing, which is the assembly. In Norway, they gather at a Storthing, and in Iceland at Althing. And this Althing is right on top of a crack between two tectonic plates. And that's where the thing people meet, the politicians, and they stare into that rift, and they say to themselves, there is something between us, and that is such a deep rift, such a crack between us. But in reality, this rift is not between the thing people, but between the things and the people. Because the things, they were taken out of the assembly a long time ago, and then they were found by the new think people, which are the scientists, who gather around it and ask themselves, what kind of thing is this here? And that's the thing. You know, there is no gathering without a thing, and also no thing without a gathering, like of think people who say that is a thing. But what do we call that? What do we call that? Let's just call it object. Yeah, that sounds good. I like that. We have an object here, but that object is mute. So we need to speak to it in favor of it and in place of it. But things are not mute, or stupid. They have something to say, and you can hear it, you can feel it, and you need them too. They're also getting smarter all the time, these darn things, and that's the thing with the things. We can no longer gather separately without the things. We are not among ourselves anymore, because they are all around us. There are others all around us all the time. And that is the thing, to listen to what the things have to say. That is the thing.
And that's why we have assembled today as ants, and with ants, and for ants, as a species. Because as a species, we are losing ground dramatically. The ground has been exhausted by extraction, by industry, or by industrial agriculture. And if there is one single species that is really grounded, that is the ground control, it is the ants. Since 120 million years ago, when they just threw off their wings and said, now we take over the ground. They are really grounded. They literally work the earth. They are the workers and the peasants of the earth. The ants give back the earth, the ground, what the plants have taken from it. They are the planet's true proletariat. Because as we know from Karl Marx, there are no more than two sources of wealth. And these two sources of wealth are, one, the worker, and two, the earth. If the worker is the father, then the earth is the mother, or the other way around. It's the world as well as the soil, the very ground on which we walk.
Neglected in the human reading of Marx is the material side, the matter of substance, the Stoff and the Stoffwechsel, the metabolism. Economic crises are a disturbance of society's metabolism, and ecological crises are a disturbance of nature's metabolism through the capitalist form of society's metabolism. The entire work process is nothing but a metabolism with nature. And we end workers succeeded to regulate this metabolism with nature rationally and bring it under our collective control, instead of being ruled by the metabolism as a blind power, and to do it with the least amount of effort and under conditions most worthy of our and nature. This was the Ant Company, the end of assembly. See you soon in the theater around.
Thanks so much, ANTCOMPANY. As I said, I'm really very happy that Eva von Redecker is also here tonight. Eva von Redecker is a political philosopher working on theories of property, social change, and freedom/unfreedom. In 2020-21, she held the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship at the University of Verona. Her projects investigated the connection between authoritarianism and possessive individualism, building on the notion of phantom possession, which is a key term also in her theory. Eva von Redecker's earlier PhD work on social change resulted in the monograph Praxis and Revolution. And besides her academic works, she also writes public philosophy and literary essays. And in this category of writing for a broader audience also belongs the amazing book that some of you will know that has been published in the first year of the pandemic in 2020 on new forms of protest, Revolution für das Leben, Revolution for Life. Unfortunately, so far only in German. It's currently being translated into French, Korean, Spanish, and Greek, so I hope there will be also an English translation at some moment. And thanks so much for joining, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Florian, and thank you so much for coming. It's such an honor to be invited here and invited to comment on this transformation of ANTCOMPANY to ANTCOMPANY. I love thinking about that metamorphosis. I love the piece. I think it's not only fantastic, it's formidable. And I will get to the question of how we might be able to unite with other species via quite a long negative route that rather focuses on the pun reading of the end of assembly, so assembly over, dead. I start with a story. A couple of years ago, I was at a retirement party of a friend, and I sat next to an elderly lady with amazing white hair, and so I had engaged small talk, and turned out that she has been living in a commune for 50 years. So I was very impressed, and I asked her questions, such questions like, oh wow, so you live in that commune, so let's compare notes with my place. So how often do you have plenary meetings? And then she looked at me, and she burst out in laughter. And she said, plenary meetings? I think we had the last one in 1975. Since then, we only do cake. And this piece, I think, allows me to make more sense of that statement than I could make for a long time, because I'd always been torn between the two impulses of finding it really scandalous and anti-political and kind of quietist, and also alluring. Especially because that woman had much more experience than I had with collective living, and they seem to have accomplished something. So there must be something about the cake as replacement of assembly that is worth thinking about. And if you want a shortcut to my conclusion about assemblies, then in a way it will be just that they can only be alive or revived, even resuscitated, if we inject in them something like the self-reproductive element, something like the sugar circuit that we saw in the ants. But I think that assemblies currently are in such a mess that we can't just go, take them as they are and add the cake to them. We need to really get out of their current shape. So I'll start by giving you a few of the reasons that made me come to doubt that assemblies are such a useful political form in this historical moment. I just feel it wouldn't be responsible to invite anyone, especially companion or comrade species, into them as things stand. And also, as far as I'm concerned, I haven't heard anybody ask to enter them from that part of the more than human world. So maybe that should be a hint that the ants would not like it there yet. So, of course, assemblies have been, in recent political theory, quite a key reference point. Like it was one of the hot topics of the last 30 years of political theory, especially kind of constitutive democracy theories. Also, it's the end of a lot of the best type of activist organizing. So, of course, we can't discard them lightheartedly, and you will see in the end that also I don't do that. It's more in the spirit of mourning something that only as kind of believers in the revolution we can see the full greatness of. But at the moment, I would say, if you look at it more closely, assemblies, especially assemblies of the form of big public assemblies and marches, are very dangerous. They're dangerous because our enemies have actually invented recently a very effective tool of making it endangering one's life to be on an assembly, and that's this vehicle attack method that the alt-right internationally has been like championing to the point, and you probably know the famous case of a protester dying in Charlottesville in 2017, but also in the big protest in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter demonstration, several people were killed by cars. And anecdotally, I also know that like those car attacks are happening in alongside the climate justice movement, especially when it's not in its strongholds, but in Lower Saxony and Brandenburg. So, and in fact, I don't know whether, when I looked this up, I found out that in some places in the US, it's now also no longer illegal to injure a protester with a car. So in Oklahoma and in Florida, you will not be punished if you drive a car into an assembly. So that's one problem. But of course, they're also dangerous in the way that they expose protesters to state violence, police violence, first of all, which is very differently dealt out according to who is the victim, but also differentially according to which country you're in, which regime you're under. I mean, in Russia at the moment, I've read one interview with somebody who just gave their first name, Anna, of the Socialist Alternative, a feminist organization, who said, this was in the last Analyse and Kritik newspaper, she said that they've stopped calling people to come out to those anti-war protests because they just weren't enough of them, and it was too dangerous, and they were losing too many people or also exposing their people to too much violence. So there is just this level of repression that assemblies can't walk against. And then, of course, there's surveillance that you expose yourself to on those public gatherings. But even when things are a bit smoother, right? I mean, of course, those are the extreme cases, but then you might think that most of the time demonstrations are pretty, like, you know, low-key, harmless, not so dramatic, kind of quite actually a bourgeois, child-friendly form of mobilizing, then I think there is something about those marches and assemblies that you could call dangerous or ableist. And that's actually something that was brought to my attention here in Vienna when I was last here in November. I saw this amazing piece by Michael Turinsky, Precarious Moves, and then spoke to him afterwards. And in that piece, he talks about the paradox that in the disability movement, part of your resistance is actually resisting mobilization and refusing to be as active as our society wants you to be. And afterwards, he said to me, you know, if I actually think mobilizing in itself, like activist mobilizing, is an ableist term. It always wants something of you. It always wants you to move more and to be active and have a kind of work ethic of protesting and showing up and coming out and like being disciplined enough to meet and gather with all the other people, even though it might be very hard for you because you might have chronic fatigue at the moment, or you might have agoraphobia, or just feel really uncomfortable around crowds or other people, or just too exhausted from your job and general neoliberal living conditions to come out and do that next job that's on your list, which is politically protesting. So just even in a situation of general exhaustion, there's something slightly cruel about the constant call to mobilizing. And I mean, many people who are in the movements right now are very aware of that kind of tragedy, right? There's a big and important discourse around activist burnout syndromes and also the kind of exhaustion within movements that makes the base more and more precarious. And of course now there's the additional risk of infection in large crowds with the ongoing and now even again escalating pandemics. well, that wasn't a non-intentional plural, but probably the next one is around the corner. So we need to be, it seems, strong for assemblies. And even if we are, we often might not be strong enough, because another problem with assemblies is that they are very easily accessible in quantified terms, right? You can you just count, and it's a successful assembly if you have a high turnout. But now, if you are a kind of queer communist believer, then you know that you are, of course, you don't have the largest numbers. You're not the majority. So a strategy that can be outnumbered easily is not a very useful one. And we see that in, for instance, problems like the fact that the numbers of the climate strike attendance has really dwindled, like from there was 5 million 3 years ago, and now we have 500,000 that showed up a few days ago. That's the movements count, which is even the highest you get. Also, another good example that I hate and therefore like to use is that the demonstrations in France in 2013 by Manif pour tous, so by that kind of alt-right anti-gender and anti-homosexual marriage movement, were actually bigger than the largest demonstration in May '68 in Paris. So we have a problem as soon as our enemies also mobilize in that same format. Of course, one could then argue, yeah, right, but I mean, nobody ever, that's a totally stupid way to assess it. We ourselves would never think that what makes an assembly successful is the numbers, right? There's something else that makes assemblies fascinating strategic tools, and you have that, for instance, in the theory of Judith Butler, where there is the claim that there's something prefigurative or performative, well, the prefigurative you would even have in the theory of Eva von Redecker, but there's something performative in assemblies, right? They show us that there is a different way of being together, and Judith Butler would say that we resist the neoliberal conditions of isolation by showing up physically with our precarious and vulnerable bodies on the street together, and that overcomes the kind of isolation and the attempts to make everybody just a self-sufficient, responsibilized or even indebted individual in a very manifest and palpable way. And now, while obviously, I mean, I can totally see that point, right? That's a feeling that if one has ever been at a demonstration and loved it, I mean, I regularly start crying because I love it so much, then of course you know what she's talking about. And yet, I think we are now in a historical situation where actually the form or the performance of that kind of mass assembly works much better for the other side, because since Corona, then crowds just have such an easy way to perform precisely that very neoliberal refusal of protection. Even like with a vengeance, you can say, we don't want to, like, we are here because we don't care about vulnerability. We're here because we are defiant, we are responsible, we think for ourselves, we individually decide that we come out. So it's a kind of emphasis on the strengths. Actually, I would say that the kind of way that the Corona protest masses can be fascist comes in two stripes, as it were, in a pink and a brown one. So there's this pink one, which would even go as far as affirming the vulnerability and be like, yes, of course, like we might get ill, but we risk it because it's so important to our together and to show our faces and show that we love each other and not be divided. And so that's one discourse. And then there's the other discourse, of course, which is just the really like ruthless, I don't care, I won't get ill. If people get ill, then they're weak and the weak deserve to suffer type of overt, more outspokenly aggressive fascism that you have in those crowds. So that's kind of where I end my list of bad things about assemblies. But I don't, just because I ended, I don't want to pretend that I've thought through all of this to the end and that I've concluded that none of this can be fixed. Quite to the contrary. Maybe almost all those things could be fixed, or we could come up with other alternative strategies, or very little fixes within the format of assembly that would overcome those problems. But I'll then turn to the, as it were, last problem that interests me the most and that I think ANTCOMPANY have already solved for us. And that is, so maybe we should just stand our ground and stick with the assembly. But then comes the problem of the question, who is actually the we of assemblies? Because assemblies, as we know and discuss them, have a real problem with their sort of species narcissism, I would call it. They perform human agency, even if they're nice and lefty and multiple and they don't just immediately perform national sovereignty, then there's still something about the kind of species self-representation at the very historical moment where this species self-reproduction destroys the conditions for almost all life on the planet. I found a very telling quote by one of the first and enthusiastic theorists of democracy, modern democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, who says, quote, "Democratic peoples can be very amused by considering nature, but they get really excited only at the sight of themselves." And that's actually quoted kind of affirmatively by a very good recent book about the assembly by Jason Frank, I think his name. It's called The Democratic Sublime, and that's also his theory, that those assemblies that give you a moment where you can see and admire the beauty and the reality of democracy at the same moment. So even in that good moment, where it's not a kind of fascist crowd talking about filling up Berlin or something, you have this kind of self-admiration that seems a bit problematic. So what should we do about that? One solution is, of course, the extension. So that we think, well, what we need to do is to get excited also about nature, like be amused a bit longer, look at it more, and invite other species, other things, or with Latour, their delegates into the crowd. But I don't think that any form of representation of other entities, phenomena, beings, life, can fix the problem with this narcissism at the heart of assembly. So we don't try, I suggest, to make the ants somehow like us and also assemble. No, we do what ANTCOMPANY has already said or shown. We try to make ourselves into ants first. So we should mimic a different type of assembly. Maybe one could say that instead of assembly as gathering, we think of an assembly as configuration, as a new form of relating to each other by a different mechanism, here in that mixture of the kind of early Marx and the biomimicry, there was that mechanism of the sugar sharing device. And I think this is a crucial pattern, as it were, of how we could do more than just gather, but organize or even reproduce ourselves differently. And I think we should stay with the sugar aspect of it a bit more literally than ANTCOMPANY does, because ANTCOMPANY very quickly says the social organ in the sharing organ in humans is the brain, and then, I mean, this is like Marx's theory of the general intellect, and that's what kind of assembles us or makes us able to cooperate. But also, I think we need to think about the cake in there, the sugar in there. There's like, it's not just that they can coordinate the ants, they also feed themselves while doing so. So they won't get exhausted, they won't get tired, they can regenerate themselves. That's the great thing about sharing also sugar, and not much as, I mean, I'm doing the wrong thing, right? I'm sharing ideas here, but you know, the ants also share sugar, and we need to learn about that. Before I close on my emphasis of the cake, I want to approach the notion of assembly again. After all, in a more benevolent spirit, on a perhaps annoyingly abstract level. Because I think a lot of the problems with assembly, and also especially with the kind of fascist assemblies, especially with the anti-corona demonstrations in Germany that were really accompanied by a whole discourse of taking space, like one slogan was, "Wir machen Berlin voll," like filling up Berlin, which really has a kind of almost rapist undertone. It's like a very aggressive way of talking about like using up all the space, leaving no gap open, filling it up. I think we need to stop thinking of assemblies as physical gatherings that occupy space. I think we should rather think of assemblies as gathering or appropriation, or perhaps, I don't like the word property, so adoption of time. And actually there's somebody who does that already. My all-time hero, Veronica Gago, from like a theorist and also leader of the Argentinian feminist movement of Ni Una Menos. And in her book, The Feminist International, I left it there, you should put it up later for the camera, she writes about assemblies and defines them, first of all, as collective intelligence and with a very much bigger trust in the power of many to be more clever than few, than the very cool and funny beginning we had of the collective stupidity that ANTCOMPANY diagnosed with humans. So feminist humans, it seems, already have a certain type of collective intelligence. And what that consists in, or what that assembles into, according to Gago, is an appropriation of time. So she says the call for the strike and for the assembly is a call to give ourselves time, to create, she says, political time. So there is one dimension in which this idea of by meeting, by coming together, by thinking together, by gathering, or not gathering, but just she describes about how kind of the messages and the agitation can cross through many different sites, including soup kitchens and cake shops, that we do some things like we create a temporality that is different from the tedious, continuously like self-reproducing, endetting, extracting temporality of capitalism. You could even say, more abstractly, Gago is after a political time or a creation of time that is not empty and linear, what Walter Benjamin reproached modern and especially capitalist time of. In Gago, she talks of time as something that, can erupt and that we can create anew, and in which their potentiaire, is one of her key terms, of new agency can be built. So it's not a kind of steady linear time, it's a time that kind of can always create the new. It's a very creative time. But I'm even more interested in the second dimension of that time that unites the Ni Una Menos protesters. I think it's the more radical one, and that comes to the fore when you put it situated within the practice of active strike or feminist strike or strike focused around the problem of reproductive labor. Because reproductive labor, in a way, is the time it takes to reproduce life. And the time it takes to reproduce life is, in many ways, a kind of cyclical time and a regenerative time in which life also has to recover and be less tired and be fed. And this regeneration or regeneration time can also unite people across very big differences. So I think one of the strengths of the movement in Argentina is that they're so aware of the plurality of the people they organize. There's no attempt of trying to find one unified subject, women or something. But if you think that they all have their different struggles and sites and ways to reproduce, but you can try to make those reproductive needs flow into each other. Look whether some resources somebody has on one side can become sugar for the organizing of somebody else, or can be appropriated for the movement. And first of all is, of course, always, again, just the time as such that you need to organize and to recover and to start new political things. We are all sustained by such kind of tides. And if we try to think about what it means to unite as different species, I don't think we need to try and figure out a way to meet in space. And I mean, of course, nobody seriously suggests that, but I think we need to also leave behind that imaginary if we want to get forward with the task, and think that what we should unite as is as living beings that need to regenerate and are dependent on each other, not as one organism, so not as in the Gaia hypothesis, but also not dependent on each other as objects, where kind of one object needs the other, but dependent in ecosystems, where kind of one time flows into the other time, and ideally you can share time without losing it. So I would like to call that place an assembly, a living assembly, where such regenerative times or tides intersect in a free and in a sustaining way. So where we don't just represent ourselves, but regenerate and reproduce ourselves. Assembly, then, would actually be abundance. Or cake. And I think I stop here.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Alex, and Nikki and Sasha for the video, and thanks, Eva, for the talk. So, well, there's a lot on the plate. I mean, which is clear with this topic, and I'm thankful that you kind of broke it down a little bit, and maybe we continue there at the moment, because obviously the parliament of things, how it's described, and even if it's a bit more down to earth with other, or it gets into whatever working class environmentalism and so on, it still seems quite big goals, and it's well, often even metaphoric goals, obviously, with Latour to a degree, and at the same time. Well, we are in a time where we feel the time is running out, so we have to do things now. And when we do things now, we're always making compromises that might be counterproductive. So do we greenwash or whatever, wash by doing these compromises? So this is, I think, the dilemma that becomes very clear when we look at the things that, as you both did, at what we might want to achieve. So I don't know, we can move away from it, but I would maybe a little bit unfairly like to actually break it down and come to very concrete things, like, because of course when we talk about assemblies we also mean society as such, or humanity as such even. Also big. So what do we do now to get to this place in a situation where we think we just run after all the things that have to be done? I know it's a bit an unfair question, but I know also that you are used to answer it. So maybe Eva and then Alex.
I'm used to being asked it. I'm still not used to answer it. Well, no, I'm very glad you asked that, because that's of course the great, I mean, probably there are many, but one of the real imbalance of what I just did, right? I criticized a very concrete form of mobilization, and then I suggested an alternative, but in such abstract terms that, I don't know, I mean, you might still really not know what to do next, and it's also clear that just baking cake won't win the revolution, though I actually think it does much more than people think it would trust it to do. And so I want to say that one of the ways that I excuse myself from that question is to say that I find it ridiculous to stand at a kind of speaker's desk and just say what the movement should do next, right? I mean, I'm currently not very deeply organized in any of the branches, and so I really think it's up to me to maybe articulate some problems and also, as I did in the book, try to describe what's going on in a kind of general language, but not to suggest the next steps. But okay, since you asked me, I also don't want to avoid the question. Right now, for instance, in the German climate movement, there is that big question about, like, okay, we don't get the numbers, just the standard protests of Fridays for Future don't have any effects, CO2 keeps rising, so what do we do next? And one of the sensible and also loudest suggestions is, okay, sabotage, like let's have more drastic action. And I have absolutely nothing against that, but I do think that forecloses, it's a kind of desperate move that comes out of weakness and that accelerates a lot of the risk that I mentioned, and the ableism, in fact. So I am much more fascinated by those in the movement who try to think more about how can we have a distributed economy between us, where we extend the logistics that the movement already has, which is quite spectacular for its actions, where you bring all the stuff you need, to think, okay, how can we make it more possible for people to engage in politics by, what can we do to help them pay the rent or live somewhere without pay rent? Or how can we fake paperwork for somebody so that they can do things they want to do? How can we get that solidarity that we have with regard to our political goals into a solidarity where we already sustain ourselves? Because I think winning socialism on the general societal level, like, it's at the moment completely hopeless. Like, nobody should die for that or even exhaust themselves for that, but we can't lose it as a practice and as a goal. So I think there has to be, not out of proud localism, but just out of despair, there has to be a kind of partial implementation of the principles of solidarity. So that would be what I'm definitely excited about, and what I think is also on the table. Also thinking about how you could use digital infrastructures for that, be it just a Telegram Geschenkegruppe, but we could do those things more intelligently, like the ants. That would be my answer.
Alex, do you want to pick up here?
Oh, yes. Well, thanks for the input, Eva. And I'm really sorry I can't be there. So it is it is a strange situation. But when we started with the research on ANTCOMPANY, it was already during the time of the pandemics, and I always liked the idea of Bruno Latour of reassembly. And we were always hoping that this would be very literal when the pandemics is over. And now we have a feeling that the pandemics will not be over so soon, and it will not be just like that. And on top of it, we now have a war. So things could not be worse than it has become in the last 5 weeks. And there's a more urgency to the question what's to be done since 5 weeks ago, before 5 weeks ago. And that, for me, has really changed the way I'm thinking or processing a lot of the things that you've been mentioning. I think I agree with you with the end of assembly in the sense that you use it as a END, and there's definitely an advantage of a fascist crowd right now, just by gathering in large numbers. That is already a statement, saying we will not take care, we will not. But we are, of course, hoping to see large crowds go out against the war, especially in Russia. But as you mentioned, it's not happening also because it's too dangerous. So what's to be done about that? And this is, of course, brings us back, like, in a situation of despair, like, I don't know, Lenin probably felt in 1916 or something, when you have a feeling like, okay, what's to be done? But there is a kind of maybe hope that now things could come together, or we see things that are connected that we might have not seen before. And listening to what Ukrainian leftists saying right now is that we need to think together the climate question and the question of peace. And I was very intrigued by the filmmaker Oleksiy Radinsky, who was using the term of fossil fascism that Andreas Malm and the ZKit collective developed for the current Russian Federation, which is interesting because Malm himself doesn't do it. So Malm was intrigued that nobody talked about the rise of the fascist crowds and not mentioning climate. And Radinsky is intrigued that Malm is seeing this connection, but is losing as not having the Russian Federation in the picture. But if we see this come together, the thing is, things start to make sense. So when Bruno Latour, you mentioned his Parliament of Things, one of the strong impulses was that he said 1989 was not only the year in which the wall fell, it was also the year in which people realized, okay, we need to act now because this is the threshold for carbon dioxide emission. And we're just about to pass that threshold. So that was a strong impulse to rethink the fall of the wall in what it means for the climate justice movement. But what we did not see is the connection of how the wall fell or why the wall fell and how this new regime came into being that is now ruling Russia, or what we might not call Putinism. And Radinsky was putting our focus on what he calls the deal of the century. And this is also the question of solidarity now, because that you need to realize how you are in the West, and especially in Western Germany, complicit, because the West German government signed these treaties with the Soviet Union for the cheap gas and oil. And it was like a deja vu of now the debates about Nord Stream. The US back then also said, why do you give all this money to the Soviet Union, to this kind of totalitarian regime? You make yourself dependent on their cheap oil. And they said, no, the Germans said, no, we make the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union back then, we make the Soviet Union dependent on us, on our money. And it worked, Radinsky said, it worked. End of the 80s, that was it for the Soviet Union. 91, Soviet Union dissolved. But now, it doesn't work twice. So now it worked the other way. And the large amounts of money that you can make by extractivism that brought about the rise of the oligarchs and then later of Putinism, and all that money flowed into the West and corrupted the West. And now if we want to confront it, and if we want to think ahead for the climate justice movement, we have to face that. And this is for us interesting, working so long on the ants. We discovered the term of fossil fascism and wanted to work about it with the ants. And now we have a much more concrete enemy, in a way, to see that fossil fascism is really what brought us in this mess. And we all know the war could be ended if we would make the energy embargo, but it will not happen. We rather spend $110 billion into the army instead of making the embargo happening. So this is the situation I feel right now, where we are really stuck. And that's why the idea to think about the ants had become kind of bizarre, because one of their capacity is that they can measure CO2 in the air. And we felt like, if the ants would really gather, they would probably make a decision and to solve the problem for us.
I mean, thank you for bringing all that that stuff onto the table, and I agree with a lot of it. I don't see at all how it makes you optimistic, though, because I don't think so. What I disagree with is the special importance of the deal of the century for a concept like fossil fascism. I, of course, see how it is important for the Putinism that we have now. But they might not have used that term, but that has been the deal of the last 4 centuries of extractivism, right? If you look at it from an indigenous perspective, also in North America, the kind of extractivism there, the oil that was found at the beginning of the early 19th century, where it started, it has always gone along with really eliminatory biopolitics, depending on how one defines fascism, but that would be, I guess, one criterion. And it's just that it now has become evident in a location where we, I guess, didn't expect it, because we thought Europe was really pacified and then was sticking to that sovereignty of nation state and some kind of international law. And I think what makes me non-optimistic is that I don't think it's true to say nobody has seen that. Somebody has always seen it, but they haven't been heard. So if you look at Putinism from the point of view of the queer movement, feminism, and also specifically the mobilization around and against gender, then it's been clear for quite a long time. Like, I mean, we've been arguing since 2015, which is also not early. I mean, I'm not proud, but that the anti-gender movement was really crucial to the bringing about alliances and a new fascism, and also kind of this complicity with the alt-right in the West, which operates, as I would say, more over individual phantom possession, like those people who think, I can kind of grab this and do that, and I am a white supremacist and all that, and the kind of more almost out of date seeming from our eyes geographical, territorial phantom possession in imperialist Russia, which is a society that still runs on extractivism of resources and not extractivism of intellectual property like the West does. So there is a different level or materiality on which that violence is played out. A bit like, I mean, I think a lot of what Hannah Arendt said about imperialism in the middle part of her totalitarianism book, and how closely it is linked to a certain teleology of one expanding power until it turns into self-destruction, is really what we see happening with Putin. And I mean, that is just, so those analyses have been formed by some people for a while, but there was no, but now I feel that analysis can't be heard, it can be heard even less, because now it's like a kind of Ukraine heroic masculinist resistance that finally brought the horror of Putin's regime to our eyes, but the horror that it has exerted on Muslim communities in Chechnya and also Aleppo, and on its own internal queer citizens before, like that's now, like it's whataboutism if you raise it. So I don't know, that's why I agree with you, but I also don't agree we're in a place where everything comes together and now we have a full picture that we can act on. We might have the full picture, but gosh, I think we're so far from acting on it in an effective way. And I mean, I'm so glad you said that about the arms deal, right? I didn't want to add that example, but one moment where I thought, yeah, it's really the end of assembly is when this 500,000 peace protesters had the effect of the arms deal being signed the next day. That was, of course, not their intention, but that was what happened, and I was like, okay, shit, this is so broken.
But the question is, I mean, I thought we'd talk a bit later about it, because it will be difficult to get out of this again for good reasons, obviously. So so because of course this is the thing, and I also think like the question is not only, it's also about the goals here, because I think that, and what you mentioned at the end is, I think, a big question when reading your book, where you describe the rhetoric of military service by unstable characters and as a kind of also phantom ownership, and suddenly something shifts also in the leftist discourse very drastically, and of course a bit divided, geographically divided in a way, but of course it will be something that will also be, well, we will deal for quite a while with what is the new path. When I look at, you know, like just looking at Facebook of friends accusing Western pacifism for the mess we are in, with almost the same rigidity that Putin is accused. And I understand parts of it, others I don't. But I'm very perplexed by that, as I guess many are. And this is also something that I guess will also change the movements, because when you talk about reproduction and care, the defense that might be necessary, or what kind of defense is necessary for this, is something that I guess, and there the critique is, for me at least personally, I guess right, that I'm, as a, let's say, Western leftist, haven't thought much about. I've delegated this question to others, or thought it might not happen. But that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm now immediately buying the fast answers that are available at the moment. But at least me are lacking of answers. What does that mean at the moment for the struggles we are in?
Well, I think one thing that is really interesting, and I think Alex knows much more about that than I do, is the very consolidated analysis of the Ukraine question from a decolonial kind of toolkit, right? And if you think in those terms, then I think the care and the combat of a nation that sees itself as oppressed, or I mean, in the case of Kiev, then it's very interesting, like Radinsky, whom Alex already quoted, says that the Ukraine itself needs to reckon with the guilt it has in historically being part of the Russian colonial expansivist project, but right now it's also a victim of that same tendency. And I think if you think of it as liberation struggle or self-defense, then for instance analysis like the one of Elsa Dorlin, where she tries, I mean, I have also that kind of, I had that argument with her where I try to say, but aren't you too close to the militarist, masculinist logic with your self-defense? And she would say, no, I'm not. There's a very different type of fight that you do if you fight for liberation. And a lot of us are practices of self-care, of keeping each other safe, of, I mean, you know, a lot of care is like, there's a lot of nursing when you have a war, then there's a lot of feeding, like, and also reproductive labor as such is not just like, it's not just cozy. I mean, I don't know if you've ever, like everyone who's ever been present at a birth, I mean, not one's own, you don't remember that, like it's, you know, care and life-giving is also very bloody. So I think that would be a way that I would try to think, but I find it very hard, and I am also partly clinging to pacifism because like I would need to be convinced still that a different, like less Western pacifism would have helped. I'm not sure that that's true.
No, I can see that point very good, Eva. But what I wanted to say that I agree that we should have known, or we could have known, by reading, for example, Masha Gessen's Putin biography, and by her latest book, the amount of homophobic paranoia is just unbelievable. And why was there not a stronger reaction? That's really a question that we should ask ourselves. But the way Masha Gessen makes sense of it, and it connects very well to your idea of the end of assembly, is that she says, where does this violence come from? It came after the assemblies didn't work anymore in Russia. And in 2012, there was not only Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, there was also a huge popular movement in Russia because it was the time when Putin came back to power after he's been only prime minister. And this kind of ridiculing of the election process, of even saying, yeah, we all, you know, Medvedev and me, this was our deal, now I'm coming back and screw the elections, you know, made a lot of people angry, and there was a lot of protest. And the people were nervous in the Russian regime. Putin became nervous, and that was when he turned homophobic. That's what Masha Gessen says. He started to call the protesters gay, and then he started to make a strong alliance. And Masha Gessen goes as far as saying, you know, that he found a tool how the international influence of the old Soviet Union was regained by Putin's Russia on a basis of homophobia. That's scary. You know? Now, reading it only now, say, okay, we're a bit late of realizing this, and this is what East European leftists are saying right now. So I think it's rather time to listen to them and not saying what's to be done. But if we talk about the end of assembly in your sense, it's also clear that the end of assembly is the war. Like the war started not just 5 weeks ago, it started 8 years ago as a reaction on the Maidan uprising. So when you said there is not just car vehicles, although this is a really brutal weapon, you know, on Maidan it was snipers, and after the snipers didn't work, it was the war, it was the invasion. And it was a parody of, it was like a mockery or mimicry. Like in Donbass, it was like an anti-Maidan, and they restaged what was happening on the Maidan in the Donbass. But when I said that I'm optimistic that things come together, I was actually quoting Bruno Latour and his terrorist manifesto when he was happy about Trump. And he said, Trump will bring back together, fall of the wall, the rise of the inequality, and climate change denial, because now nobody can deny the existence of climate change denial because we have a climate change denialist in power. But the thing is, Trump was just a puppet. He's gone now, but behind Trump we see Putin. And there is a big interest in Putin and his regime. They even said that in points when they wrote down kind of a strategic manifesto, what is the challenge to their power? And one challenge is the turn to renewable energy and to turn away from fossil fuels. And that has to be prevented by any means necessary. And this is what we see happening. So maybe it's not a coincidence that it is happening in the Donbass, which is the region, also in a way in this kind of popular mythology for the workers and who are now really living a miserable life. But this is where the Stakhanov worker came about. And this is where the workers went to work in the earth. And now that we saw with Trump, instead of giving up this toxic work and turning to the regenerative work, regenerative for their old aging bodies of these workers, regenerative for their families and their communities, regenerative for the planet, they rather go on. And this is what brought Trump to power, and this is the basis of fossil fascism. So I was really thinking of your concepts in your book when the invasion of Ukraine was happening, because the way Putin talked about the Ukraine being a lost territory or like a lost property, I thought this is what Eva describes as phantom property. This is loss of phantom property. This characterizes the rhetoric.
And it is so scary, right? Because, I agree there is that amputation logic and also that schizophrenia that either it's a brother nation, it's one, or it doesn't exist. Like that's really this kind of vacuity. But of course, I don't know. I hope I'm not right, because the point of the phantom possession logic is an analysis of how when you lose proprietary control, and the ownership is objectively dwindling, then the one way to kind of fight that or not acknowledge that, not flip into regeneration mode, is to go full-blown distraction, because that at least performs the full control. That is the prerogative of the owner over an object, that you may destroy it. Of course, after that, it's kind of over. But still, you have at least kind of died an owner, or you have destroyed as an owner. And that, that's what makes, I find that not very hopeful, I must say. But what is hopeful, and you're right there, that there is this very evident convergence of struggles, and that we see that not only would the stop of the end of fossil extraction, not only would that be the most powerful sanction that we could come up with, but if it had happened earlier, it would have taken away a reason for the war, because those Donbas regions that you just referred to, they are also the regions in Ukraine where there is gas reservoirs that now with a new fracking technology can be extracted at huge cost to the environment, and aren't extracted yet because the kind of investors that Ukraine was given the contracts to Shell mostly, and then they left after the first separatist insurrections because they thought it was not safe enough. So for Putin, it's kind of those two clocks ticking, this very quick one, like soon the Ukraine will be able to extract their gas, and then I lose my monopoly or semi-monopoly on selling to the EU, and then also perhaps even a bit later they will stop taking fossil, even wanting to buy it. So that's why he's sort of fighting right on the ground to get those resources partly, and also in this crazy alt-right destructive havoc-wreaking fake news and kind of infiltration campaigns of trying to stir as much unrest and sort of hold emancipatory movements. And I think, of course, one must always be careful to not be counter-paranoid, but the influence that Russia and the stronghold Russia has over the alt-right movement internationally, that is quite spectacular. That's real.
Yeah. One question which obviously is, again, very complicated, but I guess it's complicated time over time is that with this series we also ask about question the role of art and artists in all kinds of struggles. And of course, I remember, I mean, in a way, my interest in this started very much also 2011 being 11-12 being in Egypt, talking with artists there about and their question was, so what is my role as an artist there, what is the role of art in there? And it of course manifests very differently in different contexts over the time, but it's a bit an ongoing question that we also have in this series. And obviously in the moment we are in now, this becomes again a quite a difficult question, but I still would like to ask it. In your book you refer to several authors. Olga Tokarczuk is a prominent role, the Polish Nobel Prize winner. Also, yeah, with the idea of I don't know the exact English translation, but I guess a tender narrator in there, and of a fourth person as an author, who is basically an author that can take all perspectives at once in a way. And you quote other literature from Shakespeare to Christa Wolf and others, and at the same time, other arts. I mean, theater comes only in a dubious way in there, with Extinction Rebellion and their a little bit gothic performances that they tend to have, and a bit when analyzing the rhetorics of also of Greta Thunberg, which you compare to Christa Wolf's Cassandra in a way. So before Alex for sure will have an answer for the role of art in these struggles, but before that I would actually like to hear what do you see as a possible role for art in the struggles, and maybe not only immediately regarding the war, which is a very well, yes, maybe not surprising, but still for many of us surprising situation, but also generally in the struggles.
Yeah, I mean, it's sugar, right? I mean, I think art, so, I mean, isn't it fascinating that if you, so Alex in the artwork, or the artwork, and I mean, of course, that's super naive, it's not Alex, it's a performer, but like, there is a performance that has a very utopian kernel, like very far-reaching hope of assembling our whole species being. And if we have a strategic discussion right now here, then of course we can't say, oh yeah, next we should reassemble our species being. We would now go on with like, okay, but so you're also against the arms deal, interesting, but we should bring weapons there, and what should we? But when we have the fossil embargo, we won't probably be able to produce more weapons for the Ukraine. Isn't that a problem? Like those super depressing like rabbit holes that you go into if you just talk about what is there. And it would also be, and I mean, I know that I'm in danger of doing that, if as a theorist, you just then talk about the abstract good solution that is completely removed from possibility. So I think art has this space in which, yeah, you can try out and play and also stay faithful to certain ideas that it would be cynical to now just demand strategically. But yeah, that's what I would say, but I'm much more interested. I mean, Alex has more experience with connecting. Yeah, Alex, fighting and performing.
You also, I mean, you have been organizing talks and so on in the recent days and weeks about the war and so on. So you have also delegated a lot to discourse, I guess, or to trying to figure out what's going on, I guess, also for yourself. And at the same time, well, how do you feel going back to artistic work now? What is that? You have problems with that? Do you think it's an either or is that for you a natural step to step back into an artistic process?
No, it is of course difficult, you know, but it helps me to see, for example, Ukrainian activists, artists, and when they talk about their practice, for example, the filmmakers around the Visual Culture Research Center, and Alexei talking about the Eisenstein Molotov cocktail, referring to his camera and saying it's not a cinematic eye, but a cinematic fist that we need. And then I realized we were missing something. You know, just like you, I was really inspired by Arab Spring, what happened and how it unfolded with Occupy Wall Street. And then we kind of missed out on the Maidan. Partly because of Putin's propaganda, probably. Partly because of our ignorance towards Eastern Europe. And if I look what was happening in the Maidan, it is very similar to Occupy Wall Street, and what Judith Butler described, what you quoted, Eva, about the self-productive care, about living together publicly on a public square, but in much larger dimensions. And then I had, all of a sudden I was reading that, and I thought, oh my God, how can I now return to the ants? And if I'm only busy right now with question of strategy, of getting oriented, of political discourse. But then all of a sudden I was thinking, reading the description of the Maidan, for example, by Timothy Snyder, and it's haunting to read his book on Putin and Trump, because he writes about the invasion of Ukraine, and he talks about the invasion 8 years ago, and you think, is he talking about right now? Is it commentary on what's happening right now, or is it like a déjà vu of something that happened? And he described the Maidan, and it is like an anthill, because it is so many things happening at the same time. It's not possible to get an orientation if you're part of it. And that's how ants assemble, in a way. You know, that was always for us the kick of this project. We were watching this science fiction movie by Saul Bass from 1974, Phase 4. And at the beginning, the ants assemble, and it's kind of trashy because they all sit in a circle and they kind of talk with their antennas. Ants don't talk with their antennas. You know, they either touch each other, they're direct interaction, or they smell each other, but then they don't assemble. So, you know, they rather communicate with what I think is very funny, quote, sea males, you know, because they smell. So the ants have always been a picture for a totalitarian society, even in an affirmative way. Carl Schmitt was fascinated by ants. He thought, okay, this is how we should be, you know, totalitarian society. It's not a totalitarian society. It turned out it is rather a multitude, like described by Negri Hart. But it's also not a free society. So the ant street, for example, was always seen like, this is how the internet works. You know, you get attracted and you want to have more and more traffic. So like the ants who smell each other, and the more ants follow one route, the more ants will follow. This is a network effect. This is how the big tech companies work. So this is not what we want. This is not exactly what we want. This is not exactly what we think of a democratic multitude. But if you look at the movement of the squares, if you look how people live together on Zuccotti Park, later on Gezi Park, and on the Maidan, this kind of chaotic drive, but that was always right now, as you said, in this war, this is an experience that is really useful. One of the first articles I read in The Guardian about the war was some friend showed me, said that Ukrainian volunteer said, we are like a huge amount of ants. Meaning that it's such a huge living civil society that is mainly, this is not only about people taking a gun and going to the front lines, you know, what we think sometimes and we're worried about. It takes much more people to feed people who are on the front lines. It takes much more people to take care of the people who had to stay in Kiev, who could not leave the cities. So it's only a small percentage of people who actually decide to go and fight, and the rest of the people are taking care. And this kind of connects me to these ideas, like we talked with Sabine Haag in the Salon and Rote Salon about caring democracy. You know, I think if I wanted to start to think about something positive, I need concepts like that. And in developing these kind of concepts does need an artistic imagination. You know, it needs to give us a chance. So there is nothing more anti-art as a war, because you have a feeling that there is no such an urgency that you don't have a room for imagination. But it turns out that's not true. It turns out that it's especially the challenge to develop these kind of alternative imaginations. And I think that's what's happening right now, and we're just not part of it. But we can try to develop an attitude of solidarity. And I realized as Western leftists, we really have to start listening, and we really have to do our homework and learn about the development of the last 30 years that we kind of ignored.
I find that completely convincing what you just said. And I wonder whether, so the big, and I think we also need to add so many more of those occupations or square movements to the mix, right? I mean, the one successful anti-neoliberal, anti-fascist movement was the Indian farmers' movement. I mean, you know, that, like, we know, I mean, I don't know, I read a bit of Al Jazeera, but you don't, like, I know so little about that as well. And also the 2019 Iraq movement that again was a very strong movement of the squares. I mean, also feminist led. So I wonder whether there's any way, do you think one could go as far as saying art also has a role in connecting those different places? Or because the problem with assemblies is always that, I mean, you also quote that in your book, that people go home and it's over. Or people there's too much repression and it's over, and then everything kind of gets lost again, all the skills. So maybe there is also a role, also just for like documentation and research to connect those things and keep the archives alive. No, I mean to me it's also the work you're doing at the moment with regard to Maidan.
Maybe this is a moment to also open up for some questions or remarks.
Just because you were talking about where these movements took place, and I mean, for me at the moment, also coming from Berlin, it takes also place in Berlin at the moment, at the Hauptbahnhof, for example, or many other places where refugees come together and a lot of voluntary work starts. And it was actually organized by voluntary people. And when I was also going then, I thought, wow, this is really like this, like ants. Now, because no one had a concept. There was no concept. And that's a bit what I was thinking now, listening to you, that perhaps we shouldn't have a concept. So perhaps that's also the role of the artist, that we can observe it and that we can react, and that we don't have too many concepts before. And that's perhaps also what you said before with baking a cake, what I really liked, that by the movement or by the action or reaction, things start to get in an order, or start to be an assembly as well, perhaps.
I mean, thank you. That's amazing that you bring that experience here. And I think what you said made me think of the fact that the best thing is when it's not that you made an effort to go to the assembly, but you somehow suddenly realize that you find yourself in an assembly, right? And then the question is, how do you keep it up? How do you keep it going? And I mean, with those very abstract things I said, it was, of course, a way to somehow try to talk about that key communist theme on feminist theme of need orientation, right? And if you, in some sense, what you say about not having the concept beforehand, at least it helps that you don't already have a concept of what the other needs, right? And that might not be what they need or what they think they need and want. And so that openness, I guess, is a place in which one can learn a lot as well.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe not only art of assembly, but maybe it's really worthwhile to think about art as an assembly and what you assemble. And of course, especially if you work in collective practices, like in processes where you develop the content together, as we do with ANTCOMPANY&Co, it's an amazing amount of care work that it takes to get this process going. And I think this is maybe important in the way we look at these processes, to kind of flip the levels and to put it in the forefront that what it needs to get a process going and to sustain it. And I think this is a very important perspective for developing the concept of democracy further. And that's why I really like the idea of Sabine Haag of caring democracy, because this is where a true, authentic, democratic urge goes beyond the liberal ideas or the liberal agenda, because it's not just about the rights. You can grant people rights and they have no way of ever using those rights. So it's about civil society and about being this kind of tender citizens to enable people to use those rights. And Sabina and Judith Butler, they're using, of course, sexual minorities as an example, because how much does it need in a transphobic surrounding for trans person to be able to be safe and to go out? And that shows us the difference maybe between a society on a fascist pathway, and this is, for me, kind of fascinating right now to see, because of all the right-wing homophobic, transphobic people with their warlike manners, and they are totally amazed and don't know what the fuck to say about the resistance in the Ukraine, because it's just not what they expected. So what people say who study those, and say, okay, the leaders of this group said to their comrades, shut the fuck up because we don't know what to say. And all they can say is, oh, isn't it interesting how much heroism we see here? But this is kind of a caring heroism. It's not the heroic image that they like, which is always centered around the victim that is victimized, but it's a different perspective. And I don't know, we all don't know how this will end, but we have to see right now that a lot of the things that we thought that structured the way we saw the history of the 20th century are right now in a flux. And I think that this concept of the phantom property may help us to understand what is going on, because we need to understand that for the ruling elites, and how we are complicit also with it, is to learn losses, to let go. Maybe that's the most important right now, to learn to let go, because otherwise we don't have much time. We maybe have only 10 years, and now with that war, this time is even shrinking. So right now and we have, at the same time, we do have to resist that kind of urgency, because otherwise we will not develop any alternative imagination that we need to go on. And that's kind of the dilemma in which we are right now.
I think that's a beautiful, I just want to applaud that, to be honest.
No, I think it's very good also that by this we brought up, because there's a certain narration also in the media, which is basically, which is also produced, and there's good reasons for it and bad reasons, but it basically tells, okay, they are men and they shoot, and the women and the kids are outside of the country, and so the notion of care and the support structures and all this is only basically used to tell that why the Russian army fails. So the support structure is not working. So to bring this as a narrative more strongly also in the conversation about what is happening, I find really important.
And I think that's such an open struggle, because I think it's not clear, like we see it, or Alex sees it that way, right? And then there is also a different reading in the public about a nation that knows that it's one and proud, and they know, I get a lot on social media, like they know what a real man and a real woman is, that's why they can resist. And so the situation is open. But
no, this will probably also, there will not leave a United Nations. All these things will break out. But even the more important, since it's also a fight over narrations, I guess it's important to also show this narration as part of it. I would maybe with this then also slowly come to an end, since there seems not to be urgent comments or remarks. Maybe I also wanted to say that actually now, since we have done quite a few editions, and of course things changed in the situation over the last 1.5 years, always changed and gave a bit of different backdrops to these conversations. But I was reminded of some of the conversations we had in the past. I was mentioning Rada de Souza with her contribution, which is really, I would suggest to watch. But we had Alia Mosalam, who was talking about experiences in Tahrir Square, and some of this resemble tonight, of course. Jay Jordan, Isabelle Framont from the ZAT talked also about the question what you mentioned about activist burnout and the need of care in activist movements. And Jodie Dean, from American perspective, is saying the end of assembly. She already talked also once about the end of assembly, which actually happens when state violence is destroying everything.
It's very bad of me not to quote her. Sorry, Jodie.
No, but I think it's just to see that it's actually interesting that some things, nothing is solved, but some things connect over the time again and again. And I would like to say that there will be another Art of Assembly focusing on also quite important topic, the question of when grassroots movements actually are successful and start to be part of a government or win elections, like it happened in Zagreb with Možemo in a quite impressive example. And we will talk with people from Možemo, which is actually also a movement we don't hear much about in German or even in English. It's not easy to find something, and it's quite an extraordinary movement, I think. But also to hear about the troubled or difficult experiences with Syriza or Podemos, and will with representatives of all three movements or former representatives partly talk about this in Vienna, at Kunsthalle Vienna on 4th of May, so exactly in 1 month. And then I actually would stop by quoting you in a bad English translation from the book, because I thought I said that you mentioned the performance of Extinction Rebellion as an ambivalent performance. But since we were talking quite often in the series also about the role of art in pre-enactments as a space where you can try out something that might be of value at some moment, but you don't know it in a way, and a lot of it won't. But these moments where it actually happens are important, which was something we started this series with Oliver Marchert and Dara Yahalomi in January last year. And I was reminded a bit of that when you talked about the performances of Extinction Rebellion by pointing out that, so in my bad translation, we had not even begun to explore what practice would really be appropriate for the dying animal kingdom, because what is mourned here is not supposed to be the dying, but the extinction. We have no forms for this, and I think that's also something. It's big words, but I think that's also a task of that maybe art in this can have to contribute to that. And with this ambitious wish towards the arts, I would end this. Thanks so much, Alex, for being on the screen and for the amazing video. And really also thanks a lot for coming here and being here. And thanks you for coming as well.
Thanks for the organizing and the question and the moderation.
Thanks a lot.